In this module, I want to cover a little bit more of the basic design and modeling concepts in BizFlow. One of the things that you can do in BizFlow, and this would be in the case of when you're doing some of the business analysis work and initial modeling of a process, you may want to incorporate activities into the flow that you're not really ready to execute or complete, I should say. So let's say at a step in the process, I'm a business analyst and I want to incorporate some type of system activity. So I know at this step in the process, after this request is completed, I'm going to update some other system. And I want to visually incorporate the agent or the SQL activity that's going to do that, but I don't necessarily have the ability to configure this in such a way that it can actually do the system event that I needed to do. So what I can do is I can skip activities. And you'll see when I run the process later, when we actually test the process and we run it as if we were an end user, this is really helpful if there are steps that I simply want the process engine to ignore. So it'll skip over that activity and it'll move to the next step in the workflow. And so this is helpful when I want to incorporate maybe agents or SQL activities or possibly even sub-processes that I don't have the subset of steps ready to define, but I want to represent that in the map and I want to do some preliminary testing of the flow. The other thing I said I would describe or explain a little bit more on is the various endpoints that you can incorporate into a process map. So the endpoint that we used in the model now is a terminate end. But you can see that there's other types of endpoints, and so I'll provide a few examples here of how you might use them. In the case of the none end, you may branch down a path in a process, and when you reach that path, you may have completed that branch, but that doesn't mean you necessarily want to end the workflow. So here might be an example where I might do something like that. So once I come out of or complete this approval activity, maybe I want to send some type of email notification. And at the same time, I'm also going to go update some other system. Now, if the email activity gets sent, I don't necessarily want the process to end because I want this other path to continue to execute. So it's simply a way to say that this branch in the process is completed, but don't actually close or archive or end the entire process itself. Simply end that path in the flow. A message end would simply be, I could do a very similar thing. So instead of having an email activity and then an endpoint, I could simply have a message end. And in going to that endpoint, it would actually send some type of email notification out when that endpoint is reached. And so in the same way that I could configure an email activity, this end email is going to have the same type of properties as an email notification activity. So you can see that I have a to and a CC and a from, and I can configure that endpoint to send an email notification. A link end indicates that this happens to be the end of the flow visually, but that it picks up and it's linked somewhere else in the diagram. And that's just when you're trying to organize large diagrams and you want to show the ending point, but it's not really a true end point in the process. And then demolish end is really just a completely end and stop this process as soon as that demolish endpoint occurs. Unlike a terminate end, which is kind of like, I guess you would say like a clean end, where it's going to do everything necessary before it actually ends the process and archives the process. Demolish end is going to just terminate it immediately. One of the other things I wanted to point out is that in both the studio and in the modeling tool, there is online help. So if I wanted to, and I couldn't remember what the various endpoints were and how to use them, I could use the help and simply search for end or none end, for example. And that would take me to, in this case, various events, which are what end are. Starts and timers and errors are all considered events under the BPMN notation. And I can see that these are the various endpoints, and then it would describe each of those various endpoints and how they can be used. Another basic concept I want to cover is, as an analyst, I might be modeling an existing as-is process, and I want to do analysis on that process. So I'm going to change the process map. This is a RMA process. It's the same process that I had shown you as one of the examples in an earlier module. And this was the as-is process, or the process as it was before it was ultimately automated in BizFlow. And we see that we have swim lanes that represent the different departments. So we have the customer service team, the shipping and receiving team, inspectors, cost accounting, and so on. And one of the things that we can do in terms of analyzing a process is we can project the time it's going to take to complete the process by using working and waiting time. On any given activity in the map, we can add schedule information. And here we see two types of schedule information: expected waiting time and expected working time. So how long do we think, or does the work presently sit in somebody's inbox before they act upon it? So let's just say it gets into the inspectors or the receiving department, and it waits 2 days before somebody actually looks at this information. And then it takes them 1 hour to do whatever it is they need to do to process this item. So by adding this scheduling information into the map, and we can do that on each and every activity, we can then get a rough estimate by using the time calculation of what it would take to get to various points in the process. So if we go to the very end of the process, and we look at the scheduling, we can see that BizFlow is projecting that based on all of that aggregate waiting and working time, that it's going to take 12 days before we can actually get to this step in the flow. And based on the amount of time it waits and then has to be completed in this step, the end point of this process is going to be 13 days, 3 hours, and 20 minutes. So that's what the aggregate time is for this entire process. So that's one way we can do very high level estimation of the time it takes to get through a process. And we can look at using that as an example of a benchmark for how we might then measure that process in the 2B condition or 2B model. Another technique for doing modeling or analysis in BizFlow is considered critical path analysis. And critical path analysis, which can be calculated or determined by clicking on the critical path analysis menu item, calculates the longest path through the process. So if I want to know which branch of the process is going to take the longest, it will then determine that path. So what it does is, again, it's aggregating the scheduled information, and in this case it uses working time, and it calculates which path is the longest. If I were to, for example, change this activity and add additional time to this step, let's just say that we added 5 days to this step, and then we recalculated the critical path, it's then going to show that this is the critical path. And that's because I added time to this activity, and therefore it takes longer to go down that path than it did the previous path. And so what can this help me do? Again, this helps to show me where the longest paths are, where bottlenecks could be occurring. And again, it helps me see what the projected date or time is going to be all along this process. And if there's multiple critical paths, it can actually show multiple critical paths. Now, in the next section or the next module, we're going to actually be adding our process definition to the server in a project and then publish that process so that we can interact with it through the web client of BizFlow. In order to do that, we need to add a server to our Explorer. And again, you currently have no servers because we have not taken this step yet. So you can either click on the BizFlow server icon, or you can say BizFlow new, or go to the File New menu and say BizFlow server. And this opens up a window where you can configure the server that you want to connect to. And the training server can be found at this server address, actually. Sorry, I want to put that in the address area. So you can name it training server or BizFlow training server, whatever you would like. And you're going to put in the server name or IP address area, trainingsvr.bizflow.com. And that then is going to create the necessary link to the portal. And one thing you'll want to do is actually take out this 8080 specification here. And the port is 7201. And by doing that, that then adds the server to your Explorer tree. And then to connect to that server, you simply select Connect, and that's going to bring a login window up for you. Now this is where you're going to enter the student login ID and the student password that you were given by Handysoft when you registered for the course. And if you recall, I had said that based on the upgrade server, this would then, when you open the studio the next time, it's going to use the BizFlow training server as the upgrade server, and it's going to download any updates that your client may require to run with the current version of that training server. So you want to leave that server as the upgrade server. One key thing that you need to be aware of when you're going to be logging into the server, in order for you to do so, your user profile needs to have a designer license and needs to have designer authority. And remember, we talked about licenses and authorities earlier. And so in order to add processes to the server, in order to use the design tool when you're connected to the server, you need to have these two items. And of course, your student ID is going to have this already defined. This is for your information when you connect to another BizFlow server. This will be required on the user that you log in with. So there's two areas within the Business Process Studio that I want to just describe a little bit to you, and then we'll actually work online. First, there is a project environment and there's an operation environment. And the project environment is really where we store or create projects. If you remember, one of the processes I showed you was a return material authorization or an RMA process. And generally, for each project that we have, we create a project, and within that project, we have different information in folders. So folders to store the process definitions, folders to store the forms and various applications that might belong to that project. And we also assign project team members and access rights to this project. In addition to the project environment, there's the operation environment. And the operation environment, it allows us to do a number of things in terms of administration, like managing users and authority. So we can do that straight from the studio, or we can do it through the web client. And it allows us to manage the execution environment. And I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but basically when we create a project and we create a process in that project, we're going to publish it to a corresponding folder in the execution environment. And by doing that, we make it then accessible to our end users or our business users. In addition to the Explorer tree that you now have once you connect to the server, I wanted to spend a moment just to talk a little bit more about some of the attributes of the studio. As you can see, or you may have seen me do through various other modules, you can push and pull these windows as you might want to change the real estate in any area of the tool. You can also expand or minimize or maximize these windows as well. You see that there's a panel at the bottom of the screen, and for some types of information, for example, if I wanted to look at the versions of a given process, I would find the process in my tree, and I could say show versions. And I would see down in the content view the various versions of this process. So these panels, based on the actions I take here in the Explorer, may display information in this window. And the Explorer tree, basically you can navigate the tree in, again, a number of different ways. You can point to the icons that will then open the lower level icons, or you can double click and that will achieve the same type of action. And more often than not only can you click, but you can also right click. And by right clicking, you expose other functions that you can perform on any of these elements in the Explorer tree. In addition to the panels and the way that you navigate the tree, you also have some additional menus that have been enabled now that we've logged into the server. One, we have the ability to create BizFlow WebMaker forms. Now this is only going to work if you have the WebMaker Studio installed. And for this online course, we don't use the WebMaker form tool. We do that in the classroom, so you won't actually be utilizing this component, and you have not yet installed this component, so you wouldn't be able to launch or initiate it. You also see that you have the ability to import and export information from one studio to another. So if you wanted to go from one server basically to another, like a development server to a test server, you can import and export information between server environments. Just a couple other tips that I'll offer. So if you get all screwed up and you lose your navigation, you can simply come in and do reset perspective, and that puts the system back into the default state in terms of the panels that are displayed. So that's a handy thing to have, Windows, reset perspective. Another thing that is helpful is the preferences, and under the modeling tool are a number of preferences that are very useful to configure. The first one is select initiator as default participant. When you're creating a process flow diagram, if this is unchecked, when you add an activity into the map, it's going to have a question mark on that activity because it doesn't know who the participant is. By setting this, by checking this, it sets by default that first activity of the process, it sets it to the initiator. So whoever initiates or starts the process is who's going to be linked to as the participant of that activity, so that you don't have to set it. And this is useful when you're doing initial development or preliminary testing. And eventually you're going to set it to the correct participant, whether that's an individual or a group. But for the purpose of testing, setting it to initiator is very helpful. Another thing you see here are the swim lanes, and so you can define by default how many swim lanes, if any, you might want in your map, and then how wide you want the lane to be and what you want the orientation to be, if you want it to be vertical or horizontal. So again, that can be found under the window and the preferences settings. And then click the icon or next to the BizFlow to open up the sub-level, and then you can click on Process Designer and you can set the attributes for that.